That was the only really odd thing I noticed after that, was that I wasn't able to wear watches after that point because they would always stop or break or fall off, or something would happen to them. And that then would also happen to things like radio signals. And when I started to have mobile phone, a cell phone, very often if I had the phone on me, there would be no signal. I was hit by a car. I was told afterwards in hospital the car was traveling at about 40 miles an hour. I was 13. The things I do remember quite vividly that day was the last lesson I had at school was French. So I remember looking out the window and looking towards where I'd be heading to get the bus that day to head home. When I was home, I was due to help my father and my brother deliver informational pamphlets for the local government. Both my parents were quite interested in doing their part for local government, so we were always dragged along to do these leaflet drops, the pamphlet drops in the local area. I grew up in a small village. It was always very safe, so doing that wasn't a big deal. So we were doing that evening. It was a Tuesday evening in June 1993. And it was what I would say was an innocuous event. There was nothing special about it, other than my mother had promised to make a Chinese meal when we got home, and that's what I was looking forward to. That was my reward. The last thing I remember about that event was seeing the road name quite clearly for the place that we were on where I was to be run over. And that's the last thing I remember until I woke up in hospital many, many, many hours later, but with no memory of why I was there. So I woke up, I just remember this orange glow in this room that I quickly realized wasn't mine. And as I looked and surveyed the room, the only other vivid memory was seeing my parents and my brother sat on these plastic chairs looking very worried. And I didn't know why I was there. I didn't know why they were looking worried until they told me that I'd been hit by a car. And that was it. That was the most special thing about that initial waking up, because I didn't remember anything. The only other odd thing about it was, for my 13th birthday that year, I'd been bought a watch, which I was very proud of. It was a nice wind-up watch with a nice leather strap, and it looked very fancy. And that was something that had been broken during the accident itself. And my parents went out and bought me another watch, so it was exactly the same. And I was happy with that and put the watch back on. And then within a short space of time, the watch stopped. It was a brand new watch, new battery. The watch stopped. I was bought another one, and the same thing happened. And that was the only really odd thing I noticed after that, was that I wasn't able to wear watches after that point because they would always stop or break or fall off, or something would happen to them. And that then would also happen to things like radio signals. And when I started to have mobile phone, a cell phone, very often if I had the phone on me, there would be no signal. I would take the phone out, then the phone would have signal because it was away from me, and things like that. So that was the only thing that I could really say was odd afterwards, after the accident itself, other than the fact that I just didn't remember what happened. I sort of just got on with my life. I had quite a long convalescence to recover. My leg was very badly broken, so you can imagine I was out of school for. But it was interesting because when the accident happened, I was about 6 weeks, a month away from the summer holidays, and then I had the summer holidays, and by the time that period had happened, I was able to go back to school. So I was, it was 12 to 15 weeks that it took me to recover, and then another year or so to properly recover. And then that was it. I was just what I thought was back to normal, other than the unusual thing with watches and electrical equipment. And it wasn't until I was 34 that I was pushed to want to discover what had happened. I was in quite a bad place, physically, spiritually, and I ended up with getting acute sciatica, which is a nerve issue at the bottom of my back. And that caused me to lose the feeling in my left leg, which was the leg that I broke. Everything under the knee I couldn't feel. So it was the same. It felt like it was the same place as the place that had been broken all those years previously. And I was very interested as to why it was there that was affected. So I thought from a physical perspective, maybe it's something to do with where I broke my leg, as to why I couldn't now feel anything and it wouldn't work. And I was a police officer at the time, so I was off work and I needed to get the feeling back in my leg so I could get back to work. I was seeing an osteopath at the time who was helping me to recover using exercises and manipulation. And I happened to talk about what I thought was interesting. I told him about my accident when I was 13. I told him that I couldn't remember anything, and that I also mentioned that I couldn't wear watches or I disturbed electrical equipment and things like that. And he was in his 70s, had lived a long time and had quite a spiritual life as well as helping to heal people. And he said, well, you may well have had something called a near-death experience, you just don't remember that you've had it. And he handed me a book by a lady called Dr. Penny Satori, who had been an ICU nurse 20 years previously and had had experiences of people be dying with heart attacks and strokes and things, and then coming back and saying that they felt like they'd been somewhere and they were sharing these wonderful experiences with her. And for the first time, I was reading the accounts of these people and the things that happened afterwards to them, and then I could actually recognize in myself some of those things. So distinct changes in belief systems, and again, not being able to go near a computer without it fritzing. So I was able to see, well, some of the things that were happening to them had also happened to me, and I recognized that, but I still didn't have a memory. And for me, that was quite frustrating. Being a police officer, I've always been interested in how things work and why people do things, and I wanted to investigate that further. To cut a long story short, the only thing that I could really think of to regain memories was perhaps to use hypnosis. I'd heard other people talking about it and how good it was for different things, like helping them to get over phobias or helping them to recover from traumatic events that they'd had. So it was that research that I did that led me to the lady that I went to go and see, a lady called Karen. She had trained as a clinical hypnotherapist, but also did regressional hypnotherapy. So I arranged to have the hypnotherapy session a week later. And for me, if I'm going to go and do something, I might as well go all in. I decided that I wanted to really, really investigate this and do a full session, knowing that the memories that I might pull on might just be very nasty, bad memories of being hit by a car. And I was quite prepared for that at the time. I felt that that was going to be one of the things that was going to heal something in me, which would help me to move on. I didn't quite realize where it was going to take me and how dramatically it was going to change my life, but I was certainly prepared for some sort of healing. So the session itself, basically the way it worked was that Karen would put me in a very relaxed state. And as she was talking to me, I was to use my imagination, and I realized that I was actually back at the site of the accident, me having been run over. So during that session, I was able to see myself being put in the ambulance. And whilst I was in the ambulance, being taken to hospital, I had a visitation from my grandfather on my mother's side, my grandfather Tom. And the interesting and very special relationship there was that he died 3 months before I was born. So even during my birth, there was sadness and loss. My mum, I was born to a grieving mother, but somehow he was always there with me, and has been ever since. Has been like a guide there. I don't often feel his presence, but normally if I speak to a spiritual medium, then they will describe someone and it's him, and I know it's him. But he was actually there in the ambulance with me as a passed on spirit, and told me I was going to be okay, and just I needed to be relaxed, and he was very proud of me, and that he also wanted me to give a message to my mum. He wanted to let her know that he was very proud of her. Because of the way that he was taken, and he was taken at a relatively young age, at the age of 49, he'd never really had the chance to tell her how proud he was of her, as a person, as his daughter, as a mother herself. And that's something that he wanted me to pass on. But at the time in the ambulance, all he wanted me to do after that was just to close my eyes. And as I closed my eyes, I was lifted out of my body, and I was brought into what I can only describe as a cloud space. And it was almost like I was floating on a meandering river. And as I looked up, ahead of me was a cloud city, and there was a figure in the distance, and I was being floated towards the figure as the figure was coming towards me. And it was a male figure dressed in white robes. And as I got close to the figure, I was brought to a standing position, and he knelt down, and he put one hand on my chest and the other hand on my face. And I'm in this memory, but I'm also on the table in the hypnotherapy session. And whilst I kind of recognized that I was on the table, I could actually feel the heat of this figure's hand on my chest, and especially feel the heat of his hand on my face. And he said, "Hello, my son. I am the carpenter. You know me, and I know you. I know you love me as I love you. You're very special, and I want you to do something for me. If you choose to go back, I want you to speak for me, and I will speak through you, because I love you and I love everyone else as I love you." And he said, "You won't remember this until the right times." So at that point, I was to leave what I felt, leave the experience. I was brought back into my body. I was then aware that at that point I was at the hospital, and Karen, the hypnotherapist, actually brought me out of that session, because what I was then remembering was some very painful memories of the doctors rushing in to try and make the mess that my leg was. And I remember crying in pain for my mother to be there. And so she brought me out of that. So everything was then very visceral. I was crying on the table, because I was this 13-year-old boy and a 34-year-old man. It was quite an interesting experience. So I was then brought to this space where I had at least part of a memory of something that had happened, but then there was like a lot of responsibility that I felt had been heaped on my shoulder, because I finally had the answers, but then I didn't feel worthy enough to actually have gone forth and spoken for a very high vibrational being that may even have represented. Some people have asked me whether the carpenter was Jesus. I have my own personal beliefs as to whether it was or not. I certainly felt the love of that heavenly being, and I felt that there was a huge responsibility. And for me to have discovered that at the part of my life that I was in, I really didn't feel worthy of it. So that experience made me want to start to better myself. And I'd actually had contacted a near-death experience UK group, and I'd told them that I was able to recover the memories, and that they put me in touch with a lady called Kelly Walsh, who was to become very important in my life, and was actually one of the instigators as to why I'm in Hawaii now. The biggest change was the spiritual change, which I realized was absolutely necessary. I spent about a year and a half going to Pentecostal church, and felt that had given me some answers as to maybe why I was here. And even then, I found that I was quite good at interpreting messages from people who might be praying in tongues or something like that. I was able to interpret what the message was that was coming through, even though I didn't realize why. And I also recognized, after the recovering the memories, those particular memories of the near death, as to why I had chosen some of the jobs I'd chosen, because I was able to help people. I was doing community policing in my mid-20s, and I always found it interesting when people would come over to me and talk to me. They might come over with a question about policing, and then they would start talking to me about sometimes some very personal things that they'd never shared with anyone else, and they didn't know why they were telling me, but they just felt comfortable. And then the answers that I was able to give them, I always felt like I'd been spoken through. So I always had this heat and this energy coming from my chest, and it was erupt through my throat, and it was almost like I was given the words to give to them. But again, at the time when I was in my 20s, I didn't realize why. It just happened. And then after recovering the memories, it was like, oh, well, maybe that was one of the times where I'd been spoken through and I was able to help people. So it was then knowing that led me to really look at my life and look at where I was. And I was in what I realised that by then was a relatively unhappy marriage, and that needed to change. I needed to change. I needed to work on myself. And as I mentioned, this lady that I was given the contact details for, Kelly Walsh, she'd had a near-death experience after trying to commit suicide, after trying to end her life. And she had this very passionate vision of like-minded souls coming together to change the world. I dealt a lot with people who have attempted to end their lives or have been in extreme circumstances that have led them to, commit crime or anything. And they've been it's almost like that situation has guided them to me, and they have said something which has triggered the thing in me that allows me to be spoken through to them, to give them words of encouragement or words of comfort that they might well have heard from other people, but they just haven't had the ability to really, really listen. But the energy of the words that have been given to me to give to them has resonated to a point where that's given them, if they're trying to end their lives, it's given them another breath, it's given them another hour, it might have given them another day, given them an opportunity to see that their life where they're at that point doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing for the rest of their lives. They can change that. And that's very often been the thing that I found with this mission or this gift, is that I'm given the people and I just have to be open to talk to them. Like a lot of other people who've had similar experiences, it's a doorway. It's been written about, it's been spoken about, it's been experienced. It's one of these things where we become very attached to who we are here, and we don't like to let that go. We don't like to think that we have a finite time here. We don't want to think about the end at any point. Whether you're a child, whether you're my age in my early 40s, whether you're then approaching the twilight years, which is what people fear. But it's a case of however you go, however you leave is something that you've chosen. So the life that I have led to this point in this body, in this life, is a life that I have chosen from a higher perspective prior to coming here. Everything that's happened to get me to certain points has been my earthly choice, but I'd gotten to those certain points because they were predestined. Now, they can only have been predestined if there's something more than what we are, and it's more than I was able to glean in any church or any religious book or anything else that I'd read. It was something that it goes far outside of the understanding of anything that we can verbalize, but it's there. Whether it's the seeing past loved ones, whether it's seeing religious figures, whether it's understanding the nature of the universe, all of that is there for us because we're living there and here.